So let's also briefly talk about ketone salts.
So the ketone salts is the same beta hydroxybutyrate free acid bound to a mineral. So sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. You got to watch out because sometimes they'll do a lot of tricks. They'll say salt free, but they really mean sodium free. And then they ramp up the magnesium and potassium. And I saw one product that was 4,000 milligrams of potassium per serving. And California makes you put disclosures for anything over 100. And it had 4,000. It had 42 times. And I called the CEO. I'm like, you're going to kill someone with this and you're going to take us all down with you. Like, stop it. Like, you can't just, everyone looks at sodium, so they don't really care about the other stuff. And they think bananas are great, but not 58 bananas like at one time. So the ketone salts also have an issue where they're called, many of them, less so now than previously. It used to be all of them. They're racemic, where only half of it is bioavailable. So you have the D form and you have the L form. And with the ketone salts, it's much cheaper to just mix both of them together. And it's much less expensive. And if you're not sure if your product is racemic, meaning that it has both, it is, because it costs so much more to have just the D form that they're going to advertise D form. So if you're not sure, then it is racemic. And half of it is not bioavailable, cannot be used as ATP energy. Now, there are some arguments that say, oh, well, the L form stays in your system longer. Yeah, because your body doesn't know how to get rid of it. It's a toxin. The body doesn't know how to get rid of it, and it might accumulate and might do some signaling, might have some unintended benefits. But Dr. Veach was like, things that are racemic, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole because there are unintended consequences of it, such as your blood meter only tests for the D form. So the L form could be accumulating without you knowing, and it could get too high. So never touch. He said, don't touch the racemic stuff with a 15-foot pole. But there are some people that are selling it and claiming that they found some benefit, and toddlers that were then able to walk. I just wonder if they had taken the right ketones, whether they'd be able to run. But that's the racemic salts that are readily out there, and people think that they're less expensive, but on a cost per effectiveness basis, not even cost per gram, the ketone ester is actually less expensive than the higher quality ketone salts, because you can just take less of the ketone ester. You can take one cap full of this, and it would be half the price of a packet of ketone salts. And Dr. Veach never really liked ketone salt. He played with it 20 years ago, but he threw it in the trash because he thought that the sodium levels were just way too high. And he said, your cardiologist would kill me. The salt levels are just way too high. And the salt blocks some of the delivery of the ketones in and of itself. So it has a 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And you have to have a balance of the salts as well, because if you have too much sodium, it can create its own havoc. So you have to balance them. But if you get too much magnesium, you're going to have diarrhea. Too much overall salt, you're going to get diarrhea. Too much magnesium in particular. Potassium has its own problems. Each one of them have their own problems, and it just doesn't work. But those companies will still cite ketone ester papers and say, look, ketones work, but none of the papers are on ketone salts. Why? Because they don't work. And, the papers never come out with showing any benefit. So that's the ketone salts. Now, if you are in a super hot situation where you're sweating a super amount, and you actually otherwise would take LMNT, a super amount of salt, then there might be some benefits, to those ketone salts. And we have one drink that we're actually discontinuing that you like, called KE1. Here's the old bottle design, but KE1, which was the active ingredient was 60% ketone ester, 20% ketone salt, and 20% ketone free acid. And because it's only 20% of the entire formula, the salt load is 80% lower than the ketone salts on a per gram basis. So it was drastically less salt than those salt overloads. But we just found that the ketone ester was so much more effective. And part of the reason we did that was for taste too, because the ketone ester tastes like a shot of apple cider vinegar mixed with burnt rubber. But the KE1 tastes good because it's a mixture of all this stuff and 6 times more water. But we finally were able to find a way to actually mask the ketone ester enough to discontinue the KU1 and just have a simple drink called ketone shot, which is just more diluted version of the KE4 ketone ester. So yeah, there are some benefits, with that extra salt, and there are some talk that it might increase the delivery of sodium, so you don't have to take as high of a quantity, which might have side effects, but getting it actually into the system. Yeah.
There is an application for ketone salts when they're formulated with sodium beta hydroxybutyrate as the primary salt, and that is exactly it. I found them to be one of the absolute best ways to maintain hydration when it's super hot and you have a high sweat rate. They work for
Just
that.
make sure.
Go ahead.
Make sure that it's non-racemic, so make sure it's a D form, also known as the R form. Just makes things more complicated. It's like the metric system, meters versus feet. The D or the R is the good form. Just make sure it's that, and make sure that it's caffeine free. So that's another trick that these ketone salt companies do, is that 90% of their sales are the caffeinated version, and the ketones will increase delivery of caffeine. So it might say, oh, equivalent of 1 cup of coffee, but it feels like 2, and you're bouncing off the walls, and you think that this is, the ketones. That's not the ketones. That's not what ketones feel like. It's the caffeine being delivered, and you're being tricked.
Yeah, but that's not going to work in the heat, because two cup of coffee equivalent of caffeine, because caffeine's a known diuretic, and I've seen this all the time in endurance athletes. They'll take a double espresso love goo, and they'll be 20 minutes later, they're sitting by the side of the road puking their guts off, their head spinning, because their hydration was already on the ragged edge, and then it just they got dehydrated immediately from the diuretic effect. So that doesn't work. I just said, I've just found it to be one of the more effective things, but I'm not looking. It's not for the ketones, it's for the sodium delivery.
Right.